Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you everybody who came today to spend this evening with Heathcliff. So before I start, I just want to mention a couple of content notes. Obviously, there will be talk about racism, and there will be some mention of potentially offensive language. And when I say potentially offensive language, I'm referring in particular to the use of the term gypsy throughout my talk. And just as a brief mention, the term gypsy is very controversial amongst Romani communities, with some members of the Romani community rejecting it as an outright slur, and others reclaiming it as a preferred self-identifier. So just to mention that I will be using it throughout the presentation. And before I start my presentation, just to kind of get everybody thinking about the use of terminology and the use of categorization, if people can take just a few seconds to think about what the definition of gypsy and what the definition of Roma might be, just hold the thought in your minds for a few seconds. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about this history, and hopefully then with this kind of background, move on to a discussion of Heathcliff. So the Roma are a heterogeneous racial and ethnic group originating from northern India. They were historically nomadic, but it is important to point out that not all Romani groups today are nomadic, and indeed some of them have been settled for centuries. Although discourse tends to conflate the terms Roma and traveller together, even well into contemporary times. They left India roughly around the 11th century, and their presence in Europe has been traced back to roughly the 13th century in Eastern Europe and about the 15th century in Western Europe, and particularly in the United Kingdom. What you can see on your slide is the Romani flag, which contains a Dharma chakra, paying tribute to the Indian origins of the Romani people, and the green and the blue representing the grass and the sky as a tribute to the nomadic tradition of the Romani people. Now I'm going to get to that question of terminology and controversy. The term gypsy stems from Egyptian. When the Roma arrived into Europe, they were mistaken for being Egyptian, and they were described as Egyptian not only in the UK, but also the term pops up in connection to the Roma in various countries across Europe, including Romania, including Spain, and Scandinavian countries. So although this is a fairly common use of the term Egyptian that we find across Europe, in the English language, it got shortened to Egyptian, and from Egyptian, it became gypsy. So when it was first coined, it was coined to refer precisely to the Romani people. However, as time went on, the term gypsy became a fairly broad and imprecise category, and it is very much still so today. It became used as a bit of a catch-all phrase, as an umbrella term to refer to various traveling groups, but also more broadly to people who have some sense of wanderlust, to New Age travelers, and people who have enjoyed traveling or have been drawn to nomadism, have tended also to self-describe as gypsies. This has created at a public perception level a lot of confusion as to the racialized origins of the term itself. And as I mentioned, it is very controversial, with some members of the Romani community considering a slur, whereas others preferring it. So now I'm going to just introduce a little bit Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, and I'm going to mention that it draws on romantic and gothic tropes. And this is important for my discussion of how Heathcliff is racialized as a Romani man and how the Roma become tropes themselves in Gothic literature during the 19th century, and particularly during the Victorian chunk of the 19th century. I also want to mention, and I will return to this point towards the end of my talk, that the novel stages a type of eco-Gothic resistance in the face of rampant industrialization in the Victorian era. It is in the 1840s that we start getting the concept of leisure and of group leisure. It is around then that Thomas Cook starts offering train trips that takes people across the country. So what we get in the moors at Wuthering Heights is a pushback against this sense of industrialization. So the landscape is Gothic, but it is also a site of resistance. And again, I'm just bringing that point up now, and I will return to it towards the end of my talk. Now, when it comes to Heathcliff, he's obviously a very famous character, a very well-known character, often described as the novel's Byronic character. But readerly and critical opinion alike has tended to focus a lot on the idea of racial and ethnic ambiguity. Essentially, what both critics and readers have said is that Emily Bronte cultivates a sense of ambiguity that makes it impossible for us to know where Heathcliff is actually coming from, what his racial background is. So, for example, in an article for The Guardian by Steve Rose called How Heathcliff Got a Race Lift, discussing the casting of an actor of colour to play Heathcliff. It's been said in her novel, Bronte leaves Heathcliff's precise ethnicity open to debate, variously describing him as a Lascar and a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect, which only adds to the confusion. Should he be black, white, Roma, Indian? Can they have just cast Colin Firth? And this is an opinion that is very widely held, and it's been emphasized that this is deliberate on Emily Bronte's part, and that in terms of this deliberate choice, we are not supposed to know what ethnicity Heathcliff is. So what I want to do in this talk is push back a little bit against that critical opinion. This is part of a work in progress that I'm making, that I'm working on for a further down the line project. So I'm very much exploring these ideas, but I want to suggest that the ambiguity, although there, is part of the racialization of Heathcliff as a Romani man, rather than it being completely open to debate or completely uncertain. So before I move on to that discussion, I just want to talk a little bit about how the Roma themselves are racialized. Importantly, first of all, we get visible difference. So because the Roma came from northern India, they are a non-white, a non-European group. And so they are a visible minority. And I want to mention here that especially in the UK and across Western Europe, white passing Roma people exist. So there are Romani people who might be perceived in society as white, and they still suffer from racism. However, the vast majority of Romani people worldwide are a visible minority, and they are racialized as a visible minority. I should also mention that in the 19th century, there was less mixing. So the reason that the Roma being a traditionally nomadic community, there's obviously been quite a lot of mixing. And in the UK particularly, the Roma have tended to mix with other traveling communities, in particular Irish travelers, which again has led to a lot of mixing. But it's clear in Wuthering Heights that Heathcliff is a visible minority, that he is racialized due to visible difference. On top of visible difference, nomadism is actually part of the racialization of the Roma themselves. So the Roma are seen as non-static, they are seen as uncanny, and I will return to that concept a little bit later as well to explore in a little bit more detail. But because they are a nomadic group, they are impossible to pin down, and frameworks that are applied for settled communities essentially disintegrate when we approach the Roma. On top of this, there are cultural elements that have been associated with the Roma that have led to stereotypes and fetishization. I want to mention also in particular the bohemianism trend in France, which essentially saw the Roma fetishized in art and literature, with a particular focus on this idea of nomadism, of wanderlust, of traveling as some source, some sense of freedom and liberty, which is actually a very misguided and misrepresenting take on Romani communities who tend to live by very strict cultural laws rather than these ideals of freedom that society sometimes attributes to them. As you can see on the painting on your slide, the woman is fetishized. You can see the cleavage, but also you can see that she is practicing cartomancy, so stereotypes associated with the Roma tend to refer to fortune telling. And again, a quick aside to say that fortune telling is a spiritual practice practiced by some Romani groups, but the way it has been represented has been very flattened into stereotypes. And of course, the big one is thieves. So with that in mind, I also want to talk about the situation when it came to the understanding of Romani people in the mid-19th century when Wuthering Heights was published. So in 1782, the linguist Christian Christoph Rudiger discovered linguistic connections between the Romani language, which continues to be spoken today, to Hindustani, which was a term used to describe Hindi and Urdu. So the Romani language is an Indo-Aryan language. It is derived from Sanskrit, and it is still closely related to Hindi today. And this is something that elucidated the origins of the Romani people, who until then had been seen as mysterious, who had been seen as a people essentially without an origin, a people that nobody really knew where they had come from, and because they were nomadic, moving across space, they were rendered particularly mysterious in the public imagination. An extract from Howard's Rural Life of England in 1838. So again, very much, right before about, well, 9 years before my maths. So yeah, in 38, before the publication of Wuthering Heights in 47, describes the true gypsies as readily distinguished by their jet black hair, black sparkling eyes, Indian complexions, and their genuine Oriental language. So we notice an emphasis again on physical difference, but also on the understanding that they are speaking an Oriental language, obviously Romani. So what we get in the mid-19th century is a dispelling of this sense of mystery. The origins of the Roma people are increasingly understood, and it is increasingly widespread to know who they are, where they came from, what language they speak, and so on and so forth. However, literature, and particularly Gothic literature, because Gothic literature, as we all know, tends to thrive on ambiguities, tends to thrive on spaces that are unknown and uncanny, resists that sense of elucidation. So we start getting Romani characters in Gothic and also sensation fiction during the 19th century that continue to propagate this image of mystery. And some examples here include Walter Scott's Guy Mannering, which includes a Romani character called Meg Merrilies. Who's actually a heroine in the novel, and I'm not going to spoil it, but what's really interesting about her is that she is related to questions of destabilization of boundaries, destabilization of the plot, mystery, intrigue, and final elucidation. She's also a woman who's described as a very masculine woman. So in her body, the kind of boundaries between feminine and masculine are also blurred out. So we get this Romani character who is essentially blurring out boundaries and destabilizing variously rigid frames of definition. Then we famously get Emily's sister, Charlotte Bronte, in Jane Eyre, and we get the famous scene where Mr. Rochester disguises himself as a Romany fortune teller. He practices brown face and pretends to tell the fortunes of Jane. This is again related to the destabilization of the plot. He is performing a forgery. He's translating himself into a racialized body in a forgery that can be read as anticipating his other forgery, the attempted bigamy that he tries to coax Jane into. In 1864, we get Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's novel Uncle Silas, where the narrator Maud encounters a group of Romany people whom she describes as uncanny neighbors, and again, who are signs that things are about to go wrong for Maud, that her whole world is going to be destabilized. And these stereotypes, these tropes of the uncanny, destabilizing Roma persist all the way to the end of the century, with Bram Stoker's Dracula, who famously encounters some Transylvanian Roma who work for the Count in Castle Dracula. So Wuthering Heights is not a kind of one-off novel that presents a Romany character as a plot destabilizer. Instead, it's just part of a network. And I'm mentioning just some of the really big novels here, but there are short stories published in the periodical press and so on and so forth. So it is part of a broader trend of resisting the elucidation of the Roma as a people with a clear origin and with a clear culture, at the expense of having them tropified and gothicized in ways that can be used as plot points in Gothic fiction. So now I'm going to look at a few examples of how Heathcliff is rendered the racial other in Emily Bronte's house. And the first one I'm going to turn to is when he's first brought into the household. And at the end of it, to be flighted to death, he said, opening his greatcoat, which he held bundled up in his arms, "See here, wife, I was never so beaten with anything in my life, but you must even take it as a gift of God, though it's as dark almost as if it came from the devil." The first thing that I want to draw attention to is the use of it instead of he there. So from the start, Heathcliff's very humanity is questioned. It is reduced to the objectified it. And this is something that is fairly common in racialized language in 19th century Victorian Gothic. And I'm going once again to give the example of Jane Eyre, where Bertha Mason is described in very animalistic terms, and we see her kind of human nature collapse into a sort of regression to the beastly. So we get a similar situation here with Heathcliff being reduced to the it, and then instantly almost as if it came from the devil. His physical difference is emphasized. He is as dark, almost as if he had come from the devil, in a classic example of racialization, which sees imaginatively melanized skin, dark skin, associated with evil, and also with almost a sense of supernatural evil through the reference to the devil. It's also very briefly worth mentioning, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but Heathcliff is adopted into the family in an almost kind of reversal of the stereotype of the Roma as child thieves. So here it is him who's ripped away from his culture and brought up into a white family. Having said that, There is, of course, ambiguity in the description of Heathcliff in the novel, and this is something that I've mentioned at the beginning. Some examples of these moments of ambiguity I've included here on this slide. He's described as a little Lascar or an American or Spanish castaway. We also get Nellie Dean saying, "Who knows but your father was Emperor of China and your mother an Indian queen, each of them able to buy up with 1 week's income Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange together." And then we see basically we crowded round and over Miss Cathy's head. I had a peep at a dirty, ragged, black-haired child, big enough both to walk and talk. Indeed, its face, notice again their use of it, looked older than Catherine's, yet when it was set on its feet, it only stared round and repeated over and over again some gibberish that nobody could understand. The use of the term gibberish is interesting here, and some critics, including Abby Bardi, have suggested that the gibberish might indeed be Romani. But what do we do with these complications with the Lascar or the American Spanish castaway, the reference to the Emperor of China, and so on and so forth? Of course, again, we do have that sense of ambiguity here. Emily Bronte is quite clearly deliberately introducing that ambiguity. But what if that ambiguity is meant to point back to him being Romani, precisely because the Roma are seen as ambiguous, precisely because prior to the elucidation of the Indian origins of the Romani people, there was this aura of mystery about not really knowing where they came from. And within the landscape that I've just described in the mid-19th century, where people increasingly knew about the Indian origins of the Romani people, this ambiguity is peppered, I think, with quite clear references to this particular origin. I mean, we have clearly the reference to an Indian queen, but also the use of the term Lascar, which in the 19th century was used to refer to sailors of South Asian origin. So there's the implication there of a South Asian origin, but also because it was used to refer to sailors, there is this idea of movement. There is this idea of nomadism, of traveling, of not really knowing which spaces he's traversed and not really knowing which cultures he's traversed. So in the word Lascar there's quite a lot of meaning bound up that points in, once again, this same direction. So within this landscape of ambiguity, there are clear references that sort of seem to fall back onto ideas of Heathcliff being racialized as a Romani man. And then sometimes things get a lot clearer and things get a lot more explicit. So the question of Heathcliff's race and ethnicity has been discussed quite a lot, both in critical articles, on forums, on Reddit, in book groups, and so on and so forth. And one thing that I've noticed is that there is a passage that often gets overlooked when this discussion is taking place, and it is the one that you can see on the screen now. He pulled me under the chandelier, and Mrs. Linton placed her spectacles on her nose and raised her hands in horror. The cowardly children crept nearer. Also, Isabella lisping, "Frightful thing." Once again, I'm pausing here to draw attention to the word thing, dehumanizing Heathcliff. "Put him in the cellar, Papa. He's exactly like the son of the fortune teller that stole my tame pheasant, isn't he, Edgar?" So you'll notice that the title of my talk today is The Son of the Fortune Teller. And I want to go back to what I mentioned about the racialization of the Roma as fortune tellers and as thieves. So here we have a very clear reference to those precise stereotypes that are associated with the Roma in connection to Heathcliff. Obviously, he is repeatedly throughout the novel described also as a gypsy. But because of that broad categorization that gypsy as a term has become in contemporary discourse, the implications of gypsy being directly related to the Romani people have tended to erode away in current critical interpretation. So the narrative wavers between this ambiguity and very clear indications through the use of the word gypsy and very specifically Romani stereotypes when it comes to Heathcliff's racialization. Now, while Tom Hardy looks at us with his piercing blue eyes and porcelain white skin in an adaptation of Wuthering Heights where he played Heathcliff, the Heathcliff in Emily Bronte's novel is actually wishing for that fair skin and for those blue eyes. I wish I had light hair and a fair skin and was dressed and behaved as well and had a chance of being as rich as he will be. In other words, I must wish for Edgar Linton's great blue eyes and even forehead, he replied. I do, and that won't help me to them. So what we get here is the moment when Heathcliff is becoming acutely aware of his own racialized body. He is becoming aware that he is different. He is becoming aware that he is not white, and he wishes for that particular whiteness, which is something that, again, I propose that precisely because of that loss of the precision of the racialized implications of gypsy, has not translated into adaptations of Wuthering Heights. So even though there have been actors of color who have been cast to play Heathcliff, as far as I'm aware, there have been no Romani actors actually cast to play Heathcliff. The Roma are often overlooked when it comes to discourses of representation and anti-racist discourse. And again, I think it's partly due to that Gothicization and rendering ambiguous and broad of the term gypsy and of the discourse surrounding the Roma. So we get here a child who's becoming very, very aware of his own visible difference that, again, is part of that racialization of the Roma. And even though he does end up, as was on the previous slide, he does end up dressed and behaved well, he can never really shake off the physical difference. He remains a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect, in dress and manners, a gentleman, that is, as much a gentleman as many a country squire, rather slovenly, perhaps, yet not looking amiss with his negligence, because he has an erect and handsome figure and rather morose. So drawing again attention to the fact that Heathcliff is racialized as clearly a visible minority, a dark-skinned gypsy. Notice here also how gypsy is spelled with a small g, and the Romani scholar Ian Hancock has drawn attention to how the spelling of gypsy with a small g instead of the capital G has reinforced this misconception that the Roma are a people defined not by a common origin and a common culture, but rather by a choice of lifestyle, so essentially a choice of nomadism. This is very clearly not how Heathcliff is conceived and racialized in Emily Bronte's novel. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that sense of ambiguity and destabilization now, and what it does, and how I think the discourse should shift away from ambiguity as meaning that we cannot know Heathcliff's ethnicity to ambiguity as pointing back to him being Romani and the Romani body used as a destabilizer. So the racialized Romani body becomes itself an element of narrative destabilization. Wuthering Heights is in many ways a novel that is very hard to pin down interpretatively. It has generated much, often contrasting criticism. Didactically, it is a novel that is brilliant to teach precisely because there is so much richness in there that lends itself to various interpretative lenses. And the fact that a Romani body with that ambiguity that surrounds that air of uncanniness that surrounds the Roma is not haphazard, but actually, I would suggest, part and parcel of that racialization of the Roma, which then plays a role in the plot. It speaks of this fictional insistence on the uncanniness that also translates, importantly, into public perception, even today. So I mentioned that I was going to go back to that concept of the uncanny then. So I'll try to talk a little bit about that now. But before I explain the uncanny, I just want to note that in the early Gothic, novels tended to draw a lot on hauntings, and what we get as we move towards the Victorian Gothic is increasingly the rise of monster literature. Obviously, Mary Shelley's pre-Victorian Frankenstein is a pivotal point in this development, but as we move further into the century, we get a tendency for narratives to try to physicalize psychological states, to imagine the figure of the monster as embodying various fears, various anxieties, but also, yeah, theological states as well, but that's a different discussion. So the uncanny is defined by Freud in opposition to the word heimlich in German, which would translate as essentially homely. So what is the heimlich? In David McClintock's translation of Freud's essay on the uncanny, it is presented as the pleasant feeling of quiet contentment, etc., of comfortable repose, secure protection, like the enclosed, comfortable house. So it is the space of the house, the space of the homely, the space of the enclosed, the comfortable. Or in James Strachey's translation, it is arousing a sense of pleasure and security as in one within the four walls of his house. So I quite like the translation by James Strachey because it emphasizes that solid structure of the four walls of the house that provides that security, that provides that pleasure, that comfort, and that protection, importantly. So the uncanny is that which threatens the canny. The unheimlich threatens the heimlich. So it threatens that safety and security that comes with the solid grounding of the four walls of the house. So in the context in which we get in Victorian Gothic a tendency to physicalize states, physicalize abstract concepts, then the Roma become themselves the uncanny, because they are quite literally, being nomads, they are without the four walls of the house. They threaten the four walls, the security of the four walls of the house, because they do not have it, because they cannot be grounded, and because they cannot be settled, although there have been tremendously violent assimilationist policies and that have attempted to settle the Roma. And again, throughout Europe, they are mostly settled now. But for the purpose of this fictional interpretation, the Roma become uncanny spaces. In a way, they function a little bit like those monsters that I was talking about, with little regard to the fact that they are actually a racial and ethnic group. So the Roma become embodiments of the uncanny. They become the embodiments of that threat towards the safety of the house, and the Gothic narratives thrive on this ambiguity. When it comes to Wuthering Heights, I want to draw attention to how this destabilization, how this ambiguity is very much also paralleled in the narrative structure of the novel, because what we get is we get an unreliable story told by Blockwood through the voice of Nellie Dean. So there are these levels of narrative negotiation that renders, again, the novel inherently unstable and unreliable. So what better way to embody that unreliability, that destabilization, that threat to solidity and to constant perception than by the use of a racialized Romani character who wreaks havoc on everything that he encounters. So now I mentioned at the beginning that right at the end of my talk, I was going to talk a little bit about this sense of the eco-Gothic and a sense of resistance. Against accusations of the novel being very violent, Charlotte Bronte has defended her sister by saying that Wuthering Heights is rustic all through. It is moorish and wild and knotty as a root of heath. And I stopped on the word heath there because notice the heath in Heathcliff. Nor was it natural that it should be otherwise, the author herself being a native and nursling of the moors. So this is a novel that is very much in tune with nature, that is very much staging that space as a space against industrialization, and the wild, the knotty, the root of heath is right at its center. So what we get is Heathcliff himself being part of that landscape, quite literally, quite linguistically, again, drawing attention to the heath in his name. In an article about Heathcliff as bog creature and racialized ecologies in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Emma Soberano has very astutely noticed these connections between the racialized body and questions of ecology, and noted that Heathcliff is descriptively linked so closely to the Northern English moors that to explore his characterization is to draw a map of the novel's setting. In the name Heathcliff, we have two distinctive features of the moors which serve as the backdrop for the story. Heath, but also cliff, because cliff is also a natural element, well, a natural landscape feature. So it's been suggested then that Heathcliff's affinity with the moors, with the landscape, the Heathcliff being so in tune with it, is part of his domesticization into the Northern English landscape, into this kind of domestic space. However, interestingly enough, Soberano's article does not mention explicitly the question of his racialization as a Romani person. And this is again something that I want to suggest is very much the case, because if the Roma are racialized partly due to their nomadism, partly due to that uncanniness that stems from them not being able to be pinned down, from them not being able to be settled, then obviously stereotypes have also arisen that the Roma are somehow more in tune with nature. And this is something that, again, persists even today with widespread beliefs that we can smell the rain before it comes, or read the clouds, or that somehow we are more part or more attuned to natural landscapes than non-Romani people. So I want to suggest then that this relationship between Heathcliff and the ecological resistance that the novel stages is, again, very much part and parcel of his racialization, specifically as a Romani man, rather than racialization more broadly, just as a non-white person, but that it speaks particularly to those stereotypes. So just to draw some final threads of thought together, what I hope that this talk has achieved is to show that there are three main elements that come into the racialization of Heathcliff as a Romani man, which mirror societal racialization of the Roma, and there's a visible difference, the dark-skinned gypsy, nomadism and its relationship to the embodiment of the uncanny, and cultural stereotypes such as the son of the fortune teller, the thief who stole the pheasant, but also this idea that he is somehow more in tune with nature. So in view of this, I hope that critical discourse can gradually shift away from regarding the ambiguity surrounding Heathcliff's origins as related to us not really being able to know at all where he's from, to the ambiguity actually harking back to that very sense of him being racialized as particularly a Romani man. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you again, Sam, for having me, and I'm going to stop sharing my